Welcome everyone, happy to see you at the Free Russia House event. I'm actually pretty proud that we are having these two gentlemen at our stage tonight. Devidom Kремером and Ambassador John Herbst are joining us even with a tough schedule, so we can discuss the issues we are caring about. Today we talk about how the new and unconventional leaders are influencing the security system in Eastern Europe, in Europe and globally. Obviously we could not talk about the Ukraine with the incoming president and the whole situation in the East and the recent tensions we've been observing in last months. We got a pretty broad topic for tonight, but I think we'll try to focus on all the key issues so we all have a stronger understanding on the issue in the whole after this hour and 15 minutes of discussion. I would like to start actually from Ukraine and then we'll go more global. David, could you please give us your take on what should we actually expect after, as we know now, Mr. Zelensky will become a president just in a few days on May 20th, but we already saw the whole passports war, let's call it this way, on the East, and this initial public invitation from Vladimir Putin for the new circle of fight over Donbass. What do you think, what was this about, and what would be our advices for the incoming president on how to deal with this? And is there some particular things which would indicate the situation moving forward or backwards?
Great. First, Greg, thank you very much for hosting John and me. Thanks to all of you for coming this evening. I'm, in addition to being in Florida at Florida International University, I'm also chairman of the board of Free Russia Foundation, so I'm particularly happy to be here with this event. And it's always a real privilege and pleasure to be with John at these events as well. I think the honest answer is no one really knows what to expect from Mr. Zelensky, including possibly Mr. Zelensky himself. The fact that the inauguration will be on Monday has sped up the process. To me, it suggests that the likelihood of early rival elections has increased, so that we won't wait until October, but it will be instead in a few months. I think his initial reactions to the challenge by Putin just 3 days after his victory was very positive. It was encouraging. He said the right things. He pushed back rhetorically very effectively. I think his responses to a few other challenges, including the issue of Rudy Giuliani's interest to come here, was also the right way to handle that issue. So he has said the right things since winning on April 21st, but one of the key issues to look at will be the appointments that he makes to key positions confirmed by the Rada. Foreign Minister, the Defense Minister, his National Security Advisor, his Chief of Staff, possibly also the Prosecutor General, which is a little more complicated from what I've been told. That, I think, will indicate where he is likely to go. But the last thing I would say is he ran on a pro-Western platform. He indicated his support for deeper integration, eventual membership of the European Union. With NATO, the issue of a referendum we can discuss. But he certainly, at least from the things he said during the campaign, showed no pro-Russian leanings whatsoever. So the second round of the election, I think rather positively and encouragingly, was between two political figures, or one political leader and a newcomer, who shared an overall Western orientation. So I think that's a positive thing, and it offers some reason for hope. He will have his hands full. he is going to face many challenges. The fact that the Rada campaign really, maybe not officially, is already underway indicates that a lot of attention will shift to that. So it will be difficult for him to get some things done early on. Expectations are high. It'll be a challenge for him to meet those expectations. And I promise the last thing is I hope Ukrainians will come together. Whether you voted for him or not, it is in Ukraine's interest for Zelensky to succeed. And so I don't want to sound naive about this, but it's really important for Ukrainians to come together because you face challenges from Russia, you face challenges domestically, and you don't want to make it easy for the European Union to forget you, to ignore you. If you do well, Europe will want to bring you in. The United States will want to bring you in, and that's in your interest and it's in our interest. Sorry.
I think that David has made the main points. The one thing I think that we need to mention here is that while Kolomoisky did not define clearly what he wanted to do both domestically and foreign policy, he did lay out very sharply the corruption thing. And it'll be very important for him to move on the corruption issues, which especially are in the jurisdiction of the president, meaning the courts and the Prosecutor General's office, the PGO. So this is what I think we'll be looking for, especially on the domestic side. And as we watch, we'll also be looking at the relationship, we're not certain what it is, between him and one particular large businessman. And with that, I think I've said enough.
You had said Kolomoisky, I think you meant Zelensky.
Did I say Kolomoisky? I meant
Yes,
Zelensky.
yes, excuse me.
Thank you.
That was a spoiler.
I was paying attention.
I actually want to follow up on this. I mean,
Bring it slow.
that's pretty obvious. Like overseas, and more or less everywhere in Europe, most of the think tankers and opinion makers were strongly backing President Poroshenko during these elections. If not publicly, but then like the internal opinion was that obviously it's going to be for all of us. It's going to be for better if Poroshenko stays. At least he's going to keep all the structure of the of this coalition over Ukrainian security issues in the West. And then, I mean, Ukraine going to just at least keep stronger in terms of international policies. And what I saw that shortly after elections, it was still like a lot of advocates of the outgoing president who've been still keeping kind of strong eye on this victory, saying that nothing good gonna happen. And then I saw that there is some attempts to kind of try to shift this situation and look on this from more normal point of view that we have to deal with what we have. So first of all, for weird reasons, we heard that Rudy Giuliani is coming to Ukraine earlier than, let's say, people from defense ministries or Cory Walker or someone who's supposed to kind of, check what's going on this. So what should we actually expect right after inauguration, in terms of who's going to take care of this in the West?
First, I think that you overemphasize the support for Poroshenko in the West. I believe that there are certainly some people in governments and some people in the think tank community who thought that Poroshenko was at least someone we knew, someone who had demonstrated competence, certainly on foreign policy, whereas Zelensky was completely unknown and also without experience. But it's also true that in the West, as in Ukraine, there was a recognition that while Poroshenko presided over some serious reform, he himself was not really the initiator of that reform, and in some cases he slowed it down. So I can think of at least one prominent American who's involved in international affairs but not in the government, who was pushing very hard for the Zelensky victory. The inauguration, of course, was just decided today. It was decided today that it will take place, in 4 days. So this means that the chances of very senior people coming from other countries, especially the United States, which is 5,000 miles away, the chances are not very large. So I think that it's important for President Zelensky and for the Ukrainian people to recognize this when they look at whoever shows up for the inauguration. The key point is that the inauguration will take place, that you have still policies very supportive of Ukraine in Washington, in Brussels, and capitals throughout Europe, that everyone remains, I would say, not just ready, but even eager to cooperate with the new president of Ukraine. And if he moves in the directions which he has suggested he will move, and I use that word suggested rather than demonstrated clearly, there will be a very positive response and helping hands coming from all over in the West.
The beauty of this election is that Ukrainians decided for themselves who their leaders were to be. If we were meeting 5-6 months ago, I don't think we would be talking about Mr. Zelensky. The fact that we didn't know then who the winner would be in this election is a positive thing for Ukraine. I know Ukrainians sometimes don't like to be compared to Russia, but in elections, and I use quotations around the word elections when talking about Russia, we know the outcome well before the actual vote takes place. We didn't know. Now, after the first round, it was pretty clear Zelensky was far ahead, and the surveys turned out to be accurate, in fact, very accurate. But Ukrainians, 63% of the voters turned out. You were undeterred by any efforts from outside, specifically Russia, to interfere in your election. John and I were part of a project the Atlantic Council did with the Pinchuk Foundation and the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. We did an event yesterday releasing a report that's available on ukraineelections.org, in which we talked about efforts from outside, from Russia, to interfere in this election. And while there was interference, most notably 16% of the Ukrainian electorate was disenfranchised because of Russian occupation, Putin's occupation of Ukrainian territory. There were no major cyber attacks. There were some, but no major ones like 2014. There was a disinformation campaign, but I don't think it had much of an impact on the election or on the voting at all. And so credit to this country for conducting an essential democratic process. And President Trump called Zelensky soon after the election. That was an indication of U.S. support. I hope that will continue. As John said, the fact that it was announced today that the election will be on Monday reduces the likelihood that you will get senior representation from Europe or the United States to come for the inauguration. Do not read into that the West doesn't care. It's simply a matter of time. It's hard for busy senior leaders to reschedule their calendars on such short notice. We'll also see which city Zelensky visits first. I'm quite confident he will be going west, not east, and that will be positive. And perhaps, if not before, in September, if he decides to represent Ukraine at the UN General Assembly session, he will have an opportunity to meet a lot of leaders. Maybe he'll even be invited now to the G20 meeting. I hope so. And so there will be opportunities for the rest of Europe, and I use the term rest of Europe because Ukraine is part of Europe, and the United States and Canada, which obviously cares deeply about this country, to engage and show support.
All right, thank you for this. I'd like to come back to the topic of the passports on the East and the initial, let's put it in a word, conversation between Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelensky about the passports. So we can see the situation from pretty different sides. Should we understand it as Vladimir Putin says that, look, we are now starting this passport thing, and that basically means that we can freeze here forever if we are not making the first step? Or does it mean that he's basically just stealing the population and increasing capacity of Russia, because Russia is a country with increasing population? While on the other side, what would be a right way for continuation of reaction on the Ukrainian side, and whether should the West react on this? There was already calls from the Ukrainian current administration that there should be new sanctions imposed because of this passport war. So what's your take? What do you think about it?
I think that the most sensible look at this issue is to understand Russian passport policy. And Moscow has used passports as a weapon to justify eventual Kremlin aggression. So we know they were issuing passports in Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia for years before they took action, before the Russian attack on Georgia in 2008. We know they've done the same in Transnistria. We know they're passing out passports in Sevastopol years ago. So everyone understands this. So this is meant to be a provocation suggesting eventual Russian military action. Of course, Moscow has said that it has the right, and for that matter, the duty to defend ethnic Russians and Russian citizens and even Russian speakers wherever they live. So that's what this is all about. This does not mean that Russia will do it, but it means it's raising the chances in a greater way that it might. I think Zelensky's response was skillful. He basically put Putin on the defensive, pointing out that a Russian passport is a ticket to a society where you don't have the freedom of speech or other rights, and where you don't have the right to choose your own leader. And he embarrassed Putin, so that was good. Now, I'm not sure there's much more Ukraine should do. I agree with those who call for more Western sanctions, but speaking realistically, it's not going to happen. The West's response to Moscow's escalation at the Straits of Kerch was very late and quite weak. I think that you will see more sanctions on the Kremlin in two circumstances. One, if there's an absolutely large escalation by the Kremlin, military especially. Or two, if President Trump seems to be making unwanted and unnecessary concessions to Mr. Putin, that would also trigger more sanctions in the United States.
I would add, I agree with everything John said. I think what Putin did 3 days after Zelensky's victory is a reminder of how poor the Kremlin's understanding of this country is. They just don't get Ukraine. Part of it is just a sheer condescending attitude toward Ukraine, a sense that Ukraine is not a real country. That was a major theme in the disinformation efforts. But Mr. Putin, to some extent, has done more to unite this country than any Ukrainian leader has in the past 25 or so years. The fact that support for NATO has now gone over 50%, not much over 50%, but that it has increased significantly from what the teens before, that's thanks to Putin. The fact that a lot of Ukrainians, sadly, I think, view Mr. Putin as a threat is because of his misguided policies. And this is true throughout the region. Putin has the unintended effect of turning away, pushing away Russia's neighbors when it really would be in Russia's national interest to have good ties between Russia and Ukraine. It should be in Russia's interest for this country to be prosperous, democratic, with deeper ties to Europe, to act as a facilitator for greater Russian engagement with Europe. But instead, Putin views a successful democratic Ukraine as a threatening alternative to the authoritarian system he has in place. You're here in Kiev, you're not in Moscow. And the fact that you feel safer here instead of in your home country is a reflection of the challenge Putin faces. So I think there's a tendency in the West to give Mr. Putin too much credit. He's a destructive force. He causes lots of damage. And I would say we saw a shift about a decade ago, coinciding with the financial crisis and the invasion of Georgia in 2008, when the Kremlin stopped trying to elevate the image of Russia and to suggest that it was on the same level as the United States and other countries. And instead, he's trying to bring the rest of us down to his level. It's a destructive tendency that I don't think is sustainable. And it also has the unintended effect of bringing Ukraine closer together and bringing Ukraine in a more Euro-Atlantic orientation.
Okay, thank you. John, I would like to follow up on this. I think right before the election, the last presidential elections in Russia, we had a conversation with the Free Russia House, and we was talking that and was in position that that's quite possible that after the elections, Vladimir Putin would be able to make a few steps towards reconciliation of the east of Ukraine and maybe be more ready to withdraw from there or kind of make first moves. But then the whole story went a very different direction. What do you think, what was like a basic reason why we saw more escalation there than the actual step down?
The reason why we thought there was a chance that Moscow might move towards peace after the election of last March of 2018, is that starting in July of 2017 until January of 2018, Surkov, Putin's Ukraine guy, was conducting interesting and even serious negotiations with the American negotiator, Kurt Volker. And not only was he conducting serious negotiations, but even think tankers, Russian experts, were writing articles that had ideas that could have helped move towards a peaceful settlement, getting Russian troops out of Donbass. You even had, you had basically articles were about peacekeepers and international administration. But then suddenly, in late January of 2018, the Surkov-Volker channel dried up. They've not been since then. The interesting pieces that had been appearing for 2 or 3 months in the Russian media ceased. I was part of a Track 2 effort, which held its first meeting in September of 2017, and its second meeting in early February of 2018, both of which were very interesting. And that too ceased, because the Russians stopped talking in interesting ways. My analysis was that Putin was toying with the idea of what might be possible by negotiations, and finally decided that no, he wasn't comfortable with that, and he was going to wait on the Ukrainian elections, the presidential elections, and the Rod elections, with the hope that there would be a more compromising leadership in Kyiv. And I think that right now there's disappointment in the Kremlin. They were happy that Poroshenko lost, but they were hoping that his successor would be more amenable to accepting a Russian diktat in Donbass. And I don't think Zelensky is of that mind.
This is an issue where I think John and I have some disagreement. I never viewed Russian interest in negotiations very seriously. I think to the Kremlin, negotiating is simply a delay tactic. It's also an opportunity to sit down, especially with American counterparts, but even French or German counterparts. And negotiation for them is simply a way to delay any resolution. We also, I think, differ on the Minsk agreement. I've argued for quite 3 years maybe now that we should announce that Minsk is dead, and simply, it's not simple, but increase sanctions on a regular basis. The argument, and I don't want to speak for John, but the argument for those who say you have to keep Minsk is it is the way to have the Europeans on board with sanctions. That, I think, is partly true, but the sanctions are starting to lose the effect that we want, which, and the point of sanctions, let's remember, is to change Russian behavior, Putin's policy. And the only way I think that is possible is if you continue to ramp up sanctions. And I agree that the interest in doing so right now in both Europe and in the Trump administration is not very high. But I think there has to be a realization that Minsk has not worked for a number of years. It doesn't say anything about Crimea, and that there needs to be more focus on ramping up sanctions. And again, it is not a simple thing. I shouldn't use the word simple or simply, but I think that is the really only way to go.
Thank you, David, on actually mentioning the European side of this, because I actually wanted to go in there now. We are moving fast towards the elections to European Parliament. Also first elections to European Parliament with this British uncertainty, let's call it this way. And also the elections which is still quite unclear how they're going to be finished, because we're now having these shakes and polls in France. We got pretty strong Salvini in Italy, Orban. We got all this community of extreme rights going on uniting around Europe, which is definitely not good for such issues like security or common sense on sanctions against Russia. So what should we expect on this? Was there the right way that the whole situation in Europe would really play against us? And what would be actually a future of the whole conversation over Donbass, a Normandic format or any other or Minsk format, after we're going to have at the same time Zelensky in office, Trump in office while on campaign trail, and the new European Parliament, the new European institutions?
Europe is a bit of a mess, and it isn't just Brexit.
Too much.
Too much, yes. And these elections are important. They will reflect preferences, I think, for far-right parties that will not be helpful in dealing with internal issues as well as external issues. They also pose wonderful opportunities for the Kremlin to interfere and to meddle. So I am not very optimistic about the outcome. I worry that the Parliament, which I think for the most part has been a positive entity, is going to be watered down in its effectiveness, and that we will see a lot more division within the European Parliament than we have up until this point. Europe has been preoccupied with the issue of immigration. We just had the Hungarian Prime Minister in the Oval Office in Washington on Monday. President Trump was singing his praises and singled out the issue of immigration as something that Orban has been right on. I think that was regrettable, to say the least. So I think that one should not hope at the end of this election that the European Parliament will be as strong a supporter. I obviously hope I'm wrong, And then, of course, the issue of Brexit has caused such enormous headaches for the entire EU as well as for Britain itself, where you just wonder what day is Theresa May finally going to resign. So it's one of Ukraine's biggest, most important allies. The UK is completely preoccupied with its own internal mess, and until that is sorted out, it will be distracted by that, I fear.
I think here's another issue where David and I have a different point of reference. I think that an important reason for the crisis of leadership in the West, which has led to the flowering of populist politicians, is that the leaders in the West lost contact with their people and with their values. And I think that the immigration issue is the clear example of that. I understand why, for example, Chancellor Merkel wanted to open her doors to 1 million or so immigrants. I understand why in the United States the Democratic Party wants to, at this point, seems to be advocating, although not quite, open borders. From a strictly humanitarian point of view, it's understandable. But the people who advocate this are largely elites who do not face the consequences, the economic consequences of those policies. And the second point is very important. International elites are cosmopolitan in ways that their people are not. And so they are not as connected to the tradition, the culture of their countries as much as the average person. What I just said would be considered very controversial in certain circles in the United States, or for that matter in London or in Paris, but I think it's true. And as a consequence, the elites have lost support, and the issues which they pursue, in contrast to the preferences and the interests of, say, the average person, whether that person is in Hungary. But in Hungary it's not the case because you have, we'll put that aside, in Germany, in the United States, or in Britain, leads to the rise of these populist politicians. And I think that's the problem which the West has right now. And that's a problem which is obviously dangerous for you, because some of those populist politicians don't understand, I would say, the interests of their own countries in the maintenance of what we call the international liberal order, and the interest that our countries, the United States, Germany, and so on, have in a free and independent Ukraine. So this is an issue where the West has to kind of figure itself out, restore its own order in ways that are sensible and politically sustainable. I suspect this will happen, but we're now in a very disorderly period because this is not the current situation.
I just said very quickly, I think if you look at the top EU officials, Tusk, Juncker, and Mogherini, the only one Ukraine will miss is Tusk, who has been a strong supporter. I think you will be happy to see Mogherini leave. I think you will be happy to see Juncker leave. But let's see who replaces them. Just when you think things can't get worse, maybe they will. But Tusk has been a very strong supporter. So I do think that there is an opportunity here for some better leadership that will be more sympathetic and understanding of Ukraine. But there is this problem as well that most European leaders do not want strong leadership in Brussels. They don't want to have a possible rival center of power to their own national centers of power. So we'll see what transpires at the end of these elections.
Okay, thank you. Pardon. Yeah, just so I wouldn't be the only person to ask questions, but is there anyone who wants to ask something? Can I have a colleague to help me with that?
Now it's working. Alexis, I have 3 questions, but they're quite important one, and starting from maybe switching to what you ended up. Okay, we can talk a lot about sanctions, about some pressure in Russia, but you're absolutely right that, for example, you see that West should impose more sanctions on Russia in order to influence. Actually, it's not doing too much in this direction. Be it positive or negative, it could be discussed. But if we take in the other side of the coin, for example, for Ukrainians, let's be honest and blunt, it's not so much about increasing some pressure on Russia, but improving life here. And maybe the point where the West, maybe, could be united much more easier, is not about more sanctions on Russia, but to make Ukraine success story. This could be some kind of West Germany, East Germany, just example, where not taking direct military steps for increasing pressure, but by the fact that you are showing for the people that this is a success story, and then you take in all the people, Ukrainians and also Russians, by success story. And the question is, whether do you see here some potential for this idea and readiness of the West to invest into success story of Ukraine? The second question will be not talking about Zelensky team, where many of the people, and you probably haven't guessed who will be his team. One of the important positions is actually, and his responsibility is foreign policy, and the Minister for Foreign Policy. Actually, to 90%, Mr. Clinton will end his tenure with Mr. Poroshenko. And then the question, who will be the next? And the question to you for both, because you're experienced guys, is not a recommendation, but what 5 persons could you see as next Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine? And because it could not only be diplomats, because for US, if I'm not mistaken, since 90s, we didn't have any professional diplomat as state secretary.
We've never had.
Sometimes you had.
Never.
Okay, not point of discussion, but nevertheless for Ukraine, whether it would be the case, top 5 figures for you who could be quite good. And the last question, which is a very sensible one, you mentioned at the beginning, let's call it a story about some phrases by Mr. Giuliani, some discussion here, allegations. What I see, and what could be quite negative, if, for example, Ukraine will become some kind of point of disagreements between Republicans and Democrats, using this in your already started presidential campaign. What you would recommend Ukraine to do in this case? To be as distant as it is possible to this story, or to take some kind of stance in this story? Because the story is already, not only in the media, but on some level of discussion. So, thanks.
Maybe I'll start with the last question first. Stay out. Don't get dragged in. That would be my strong advice, and I think so far that seems to be Mr. Zelensky's position as well. I see only downsides, only negatives, if you allow yourselves to get dragged into this process. And I'm sorry that we even have this conversation, but there we are. That's our politics back home. I'm reluctant to name any names because I think an endorsement from, at least from me, will make sure that person never gets the job. And I like people here, so I don't want to curse them like that or jinx them. I think there are some great candidates. That's right. I think there are some great candidates, and I think I hope you will take this the right way. I think the person needs to speak good English. I'm sorry to say that, but I think it's just a reality these days in diplomacy. So maybe that eliminates a few people. And then quickly on the first question, yeah, absolutely, Ukraine needs to stay focused on progressing economically. That is critically important. I think you also, though, have the unfortunate reality that you have to defend your country. You never know what Putin will do, particularly if problems in Russia get worse for him and his numbers continue to drop. I'm not predicting a major new military campaign by him, but it can't be ruled out. And so I give credit to the Trump administration for providing lethal military assistance to Ukraine. I think there is more that could be done with anti-ship and anti-aircraft weapons as well. It's important not just militarily, it's important symbolically as a show of solidarity. And it also enables some European countries who want to take those steps to then follow the US lead. Moving on the economy so that that person who came up to me at the polling station, so that life is made a little better for her.
I would endorse everything David said, and the only thing I would add concerns your first question. What you describe as a smart Western policy has in fact been Western policy for the last 5 years. The IMF and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development have poured in billions of dollars into Ukraine precisely to promote reform. And they've done that with the resources coming from the United States, the EU, and other countries. But it's all been done on the basis of specific reform measures. In other words, it's been used both as a carrot and in a sense as a stick, both holding it as a stick, to make sure that both the leadership here, the President, the Prime Minister, and the Rada makes the reform steps. And I think that's exactly the right approach.
I have a question clarifying a little bit this situation in internal American politics connected with this Ukrainian interference. It's called now. Do you expect any kind of consequences towards Ukraine after this whole talk scandals? Could the American policies, foreign policies towards Trump administration policies towards Ukraine change somehow due to this whole scandal with all these issues connected to the interference side of Clinton and Biden? And the second question is, what do you think will Trump administration change their tactics towards Russia after this Mueller report ended up? And recently there was a meeting with Putin and Kakova meeting. Would it somehow also influence Ukrainian interests? Do you expect some major changes?
Regarding the question of alleged Ukrainian interference in our election, this is a dangerous issue for Ukraine because it's possible that Ukraine could become a partisan issue. And certainly the way Giuliani has played this pushes in that direction. And I agree with David that Zelensky's response saying he can't meet with Giuliani about the subject because it's clearly an internal American political matter was very smart and also true. And I suspect this will be managed, but it's not certain. And it cannot be ruled out this could make the White House angry, which could have consequences for the bilateral relationship, although I do not expect that to happen. In part because I think there'd be first of all, I don't think that the President's advisors, his foreign policy team, Bolton and Pompeo, are going to support that. And the President's own instincts on Russia have been kept within boundaries by his advisors and by the Congress. And I don't think the Congress, certainly the Democrats would not go along. And I suspect there'd be a certain number of Republicans also would not go along. So the point is, I don't think it will have negative consequences, but you can't dismiss the possibility. Now, your other question was on changes in policy after the Mueller report. Here too, well, whatever Trump's instincts on the Kremlin, and they do seem peculiar, they have been kept in check by his advisors, by Congress, and also by the Mueller investigation. So the removal of the Mueller investigation leads naturally to the question you ask. I still think those other two sets of obstacles, or those other two safety guards, remain in place. So the policy probably will not change. Probably is not the same as saying definitely. I believe that the Pompeo visit to Sochi was a normal round of diplomatic interaction. I didn't see in anything that Pompeo said a willingness to give Putin what Putin wants. And I think that Pompeo has a very realistic understanding of Putin's aggressive agenda. We know that there's talk about Trump and Putin meeting at the G20 session at the end of June. So Pompeo was also in Russia to talk about that visit, that meeting. I don't know what President Trump will do or say at that meeting. We'll wait and see. But I think it's safe to predict if President Trump appears weak at a press conference after that meeting, Congress and his own administration will react in a way to make sure that American policy is not weak.
I would just emphasize that, what John mentioned, the Congress, there is bipartisan support, Republicans, Democrats. You have a lot of friends and allies in the Congress, and I can't envision that changing. I do think the administration's, and I'm going to use these words carefully, decisions and actions, for the most part, have been positive. Keeping sanctions, even increasing them, though not as much as we would like. The lethal assistance to Ukraine, providing liquefied natural gas to the region, increasing the U.S. military presence in the region. All of these things, expelling 60 Russian diplomats after the Skripal poisoning. And yet, the president's rhetoric does not match with those decisions and actions, and therefore, I don't call it a policy. I think it's confusion. And I wish the president's rhetoric would match the actions and decisions of the administration. I think Secretary Pompeo handled himself very well in Sochi, at least publicly said the right things. As John said, it's a preparation for the meeting that is expected at the G20. And that's where we come back to the rhetoric and the actions and decisions maybe not lining up. But I think I don't worry about a grand bargain. I think people here are worried, and have been for quite a few years, that we will trade Ukraine now in exchange, not for Syria, but for Venezuela. I don't think that's likely at all. Because I think Putin's bluffing on Venezuela. We might be bluffing on Venezuela. But there's nothing to trade when it comes to Putin and Venezuela and Ukraine.
More questions? Go.
Thank you for this great conversation. I'd like to ask you on your thoughts about the Russia perspective in 5-10 years. Thank you.
Let's remember that Lukashenko has been president since 1994, and he is brilliant at playing Russia and the West off of each other. He has now decided to allow the U.S. ambassador to return to Minsk. I was in the government at the time when our ambassador in March of 2008 was expelled. We responded, and the political situation inside Belarus has really not gotten much better. And so I think it would be a mistake on the part of the United States to view Belarus simply through the prism of Moscow. We should continue to push for political liberalization in Belarus. He needs us more than we need him, frankly. I want to preserve Belarus' sovereignty and independence, but Mr. Lukashenko has done some real damage to Belarus' sovereignty and independence in order to stay in power for, 25 years? Rather amazing. And I think with Nazarbayev kind of resigning or retiring, I think Lukashenko now holds the title of being in power the longest in this region, so let's not forget that either.
I'd love that. Let's do that.
My question is two questions actually. Today, Mr. Kakova, it's Naftogaz head in Ukraine, point that even despite Nord Stream 2 development, even if Nord Stream 2 is not built and launched completely fully until the end of the year, still Russia has expanded its capacities in order to be able to block gas transit through Ukraine during the next winter time completely. So in order to provoke gas crisis. The question is, what's your forecast with regard to those developments, and also maybe a few comments about Nord Stream 2. And second question is, as you're probably aware, there were long years of fights on the platform of Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. There's now highly possible developments coming that the Russian delegation can receive back their credentials. And Mr. Jagland has made lots of efforts during those years when he was, now it's the end of his term, but when he was the head of the Council of Europe. So what's your focus on this platform developments and this platform? As you know, probably for our members of parliament, this was an important platform of defending our interests. Thank you.
I'll take the Nord Stream 2 question. First, it is true that Nord Stream 2 is getting closer to completion. I don't believe, though, that this is absolutely certain that it will be complete. This is one issue where President Trump has taken a very strong, I think, correct position that Nord Stream 2 should not be built, and has threatened sanctions, although he has not promised sanctions. We know that legislation has been introduced both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate that would sanction companies that provide technology for building Nord Stream 2. So it's possible this legislation will pass. There's also the German position. Now, point of fact, Merkel has doubled down in support of Nord Stream 2 over the past, certainly the past 5 or so months, going back to the Munich Security Conference, well, actually that's 3 months ago. But it's also true that Merkel has said that Ukraine's interests should be protected as Nord Stream 2 is completed, and that a large amount of gas should be guaranteed for transit through Ukraine's pipelines. And interestingly, the Kremlin is enjoying making fun of Chancellor Merkel. In February, the Russian Energy Minister Novak said that, oh yeah, we'll continue to send gas through Ukraine if, one, that the commercial terms are acceptable, and everybody agrees that's a reasonable condition, but two, if all of the disputes between Naftogaz and Gazprom are resolved by the end of this year. The Germans understand that this is unacceptable. And in fact, the Foreign Ministry, which is always very proud to support Nord Stream 2, told me this is unacceptable. Medvedev, a few weeks after that, repeated those two conditions and added a third, which is there must be political stability in Ukraine. And while Ukraine is politically stable, the Kremlin never acknowledges that. And again, the Germans know that that is not a good Russian position, and that it challenges the German assurances on gas. What that says to me, oh, and finally, of course, you had that very strange meeting in Moscow between Medvedev and Boyko and Medvedchuk, in which Medvedev said, oh no, gas supplies to Ukraine will cease on January 1, 2020. So that's even more egregious than what Medvedev had said before. What that tells me is if the United States were to sanction Nord Stream 2, and were to properly present in Berlin and in Brussels how the Kremlin was going to make Chancellor Merkel's guarantees to Ukraine a joke, the prospects of stopping it are real. But having said all that, this is definitely a long shot. There are greater odds that Nord Stream 2 will be completed.
Just very quickly on the Parliamentary Assembly, Putin has done nothing to warrant a return, just like he's done nothing to warrant the reconstitution of the G8. In fact, things have gotten worse since Russia's expulsion from these bodies. We look at what's happening in Syria, what obviously happens to this country in Donbass on a daily basis. You look at the murder of 3 Russian journalists in Africa. The human rights abuses inside Russia have gotten significantly worse. Free Russia Foundation was part of a report that was released 2 weeks ago in Washington about, was it 287 political prisoners in Putin's Russia today. More than when Sakharov was in prison in the Soviet times. And it obviously includes many Ukrainians, including the 24 sailors, Oleg Sentsov and others, Crimeans. And so the situation inside Russia has gotten worse. You know this much better than I do. The situation in terms of Russian abuses outside of Russia has gotten worse. So there's no justification whatsoever for allowing Putin to come back to these bodies and try to undermine them from within.
Okay. I'll just ask the last question, and then we're going to try to
We have to go to bed.
Me too, actually. I woke up at 4 a.m. today.
I woke up at 2:30, so
All right.
I can't sleep when I'm trying to.
So what I wanted to ask at the end of this conversation is that, so on my observation, the last years we got more leaders who are rather than like institutional leaders, are like more Facebook leaders or the leaders from the right side. Yeah, Donald Trump with his nuclear Twitter. Now Zelensky, I mean Macron is now having some problems with his soft powers, as mentioned earlier, but he was still kind of superstar at some point. And probably after the election to European Parliament, he's gonna try to regain this. So what should we expect? And I mean, how should we actually count on what's going to be the next steps, especially in terms of like the Western coalition on the conflict in Ukraine, or like basically in the Black Sea region, and with all like upcoming problems, when we basically got the leaders who from one side are, well, they're very qualified in terms of solving things through the soft powers, but on another side they don't have kind of institutional, it looked like sometimes they don't have enough institutional capacity to actually solve the issues before they get into power. And what would be, I mean, what do we expect from Zelensky on these two? Because like, as it was mentioned earlier, we see that his influence might be way beyond the Ukrainian borders. And now we're going to have like Russian leaders who are looking at the President Zelensky and President Trump via social media, who can like, you know, have all the public politics experience from them rather than from Vladimir Putin.
You know, I think, let me answer it this way. Zelensky won because there was a strong anti-establishment mood in this country, and I understand that. Zelensky also won through the power of television. And so maybe he and Trump can establish some common ground. Trump likes to think he was a TV star as well. I think his ratings were going down toward the end. He came to office through an election that also reflected an anti-establishment mood. So maybe they can find some common ground based on their election victories, because it would obviously be important for Ukraine and U.S.-Ukrainian relations for the two presidents to get along while also deepening ties beyond just the presidential level, but with Congress and other parts of the administration.
If this issue of alleged Ukrainian interference in the U.S. political process can be managed and I think it will be, but it's not certain. I think there will be an improvement in relations between Washington and Kiev. And I think that, in fact, Zelensky's peculiar background will open a door which Poroshenko's could not. And I think that the overall policy in Washington, David and I said, we think the overall policy remain the same, but this element of policy, this element of the relationship may improve. But more broadly, what's happening in Europe, it's hard to say. Who will follow Merkel in the Chancellery is a very, very important question. I mean, I criticized her rote formulation that, there's no military solution to Donbass. That was used to justify Western weakness. But on sanctions, she was very important and very good. If AKK is her successor, I suspect everything will be fine and maybe a little bit better. But who knows whether Germany? And the same is true of France. I mean, we were all delighted when Macron won, but the alternatives to him didn't look so good. And if Fillon had not had that scandal, he might well have won. And now, that does not mean France would have headed in a dark direction, but his own love affair with Putin was a matter of real concern. So Europe is in a strange place, and President Trump's, I think this adjective is the right one, truculent approach towards our allies is a problem in making sure, as we try to maintain a steady hand in various European capitals. I mean, we don't really want Mr. Farage to be the principal influence in London.
Or Mr. Corbyn.
Or that's right, in Budapest.
No, Corbyn.
Oh, Corbyn. Oh, Corbyn. Corbyn in Britain and Orban in Budapest, yes.
Corbyn could go to Hungary.
That's right. Yes, my mother would say he's from Hungary. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, John, David, thanks a lot for coming for this event. Really appreciate the time in this discussion. Thanks everyone for coming to this event too. We are looking forward always to have you back. And enjoy your evening.
Actually, can I just say one more thing?
Oh yeah, sure.
An excellent booklet has come. I don't know, it may not have come out yet. Called Russia 2030, done by a certain organization. I think it's Open Russia, right?
Free Russia.
Yeah, Free Russia. Excuse me. Well, also even though not Open Russia, very good booklet, which I strongly recommend.
Even better than it's Free Russia.